real shit anymore.
You have to have these difficult conversations.
So the movement is about equality.
That was a really intense debate.
Let's just keep it strictly about facts and we'll be good.
I mean, this is a verbal fight. I mean,
it is.
We invite you to be a part of the league and participate in actually debating.
Can you hear me now?
Good evening, Great Debate League. I am your moderator and host for this evening, Ebony Johnson. We appreciate you for taking part in tonight's debate, and we invite you to engage with us in the comments and post questions for the debaters. Tonight's premise: gender oppression is more of a significant challenge than racial oppression in the United States of America. Arguing the affirmative, native of Lagos, Nigeria, mother and aspiring travel journalist, Funmilayo Ekundayo. Arguing the negative, from Washington, D.C., activist and revolutionary with a Bachelor's of Science in Philosophy, Cameron Montgomery. Tonight's judges: she calls Pensacola, Florida home, is president of Black Young Progressives, and chief of staff for the Broward Democratic Party, Judge Amber Vaughn. Kansas City, Missouri native and psychiatric nurse working to address the mental wellness needs of our community, Judge Faraha Nia. And our final judge for tonight, coming from the hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, with 20 years of scholar activism in the areas of criminal justice reform and Black empowerment, Judge and Dr. Olufemi Onifade. Tonight's guiding definitions, gender, either of the two sexes, biological male and female. Racial, on the grounds of or connected with difference in race. Significant challenge, a harmful situation that is worthy of consideration and needs to be overcome. Parameters, we will be including all of history. No specific time frame has been designated. This is a ranked debate. There will be no personal attacks of any kind, no profanity, and no interrupting. Both participants are allowed to call a fact-check timeout only during one of their designated speaking times. This episode of the Great Debate League is brought to you by Ebony's Bones, a live weekly radio show and podcast that questions, explores, and decolonizes for Black folk. And here we go with round one, opening statements. Each debater has an uninterrupted 4 minutes to provide an opening statement. We will start with the affirmative, arguing the affirmative, Funmilayo Ekundayo.
Thank you very much, Ebony, for having me here again. Now, the debate of gender versus racial oppression should start with a few questions, like who? Who does the issue of gender oppression impact? And who does the issue of racial oppression affect? Do these two groups overlap? And if so, where do they overlap? With women being 51.1% of the total US population, based on numbers alone, the issue of gender oppression affects more individuals than racial oppression. Now, when we speak of racial oppression, we must note that there are many communities of minorities that experience racial oppression in the United States, but Black Americans make up 13% of that population, and white Americans, including white Hispanics and Latinos, make up 77% of that population. Now, my opponent diminished the severity of gender oppression during his pre-debate interview by pointing to the idea that gender oppression is intercommunal. He is correct. In the same way that other crimes are generally committed intercommunally. Now, let me be clear. Gender oppression and racial oppression are not opposing struggles that need to be isolated and solved individually. Oppression is about power, having power, asserting power in as many forms as possible, and maintaining that power. Oppression is defined as malicious and unjust treatment and exercise of power, often under the guise of government, authority, or cultural practices. Now, gender oppression is both overt and covert, just like racial oppression. The two do share commonalities in their historic tales of social acceptance and communal practice. These two forms of oppression exist overtly in our laws of the past and the present. We see this behavior in the laws created by our government in regard to the autonomy of women's bodies in the healthcare system. We see it in weddings where fathers hand over their daughters to their new owners. Husbands. We see it when men only accept a rejection if the woman is already taken. Now, the system of education was reserved for men as well. As for the woman, she was just thought that her place is to maintain the home. Now, as far as racial oppression, we are all aware of the history of this country, where anything darker than burnt pink is considered an other. And at one point, it was not even worth being thought of as a civilized human. Gender and race has been used as powerful tools by those who wield systemic power. Now, Abdul Baha states, "The world has been ruled by force, and man has dominated over woman by reason of his more forceful and aggressive qualities, both of mind and of body. But the balance is already shifting. Force is losing its dominance, and mental alertness, intuition, and the spiritual qualities of love and service in which woman is strong is gaining ground." The Baha'i scripture emphatically.
All right, thank you so much, Funmilayo. That is your time. And so now we are going to move to arguing the negative. His opening statement, Cameron Montgomery, you have 4 minutes as well. Cameron, your mic is muted. If you can unmute your, there you go. Okay, we'll start again with your 4 minutes, Cameron.
Can you guys hear me? So I want to thank you guys for allowing me to debate this evening. One of the biggest things I want to preface is that gender oppression is a very serious issue that we must address, right? With the understanding that the Black female is the most oppressed, whether it's a child or whether it's a grown adult woman, demographic across the globe and throughout history. But particularly in the American context, we can see that as you take the progression of melanin, right, in someone's skin, pigmentation, right, along with the level of oppression, we can see that as you get darker in pigmentation, you get greater levels of oppression. Now, I want us to focus on a term called the Yurugu. It's a term coined by Francis Cress Welsing, right? It explains the white male survival thrust and worldview, in which, in an understanding and recognition of the recessive nature of their DNA, there is a innate psychological force within them that causes them to strike out and try to dominate and in many cases oppress other racial individuals. So as my opponent mentioned, the darker you are, and as I mentioned, the darker you are, the more oppression you face. And here in America, we have a rich history of oppression, no matter whether we look at the Native Americans through the Trail of Tears, whether we look at the xenophobia and our inability to accept immigrants coming to this country, whether we look at slavery, Jim Crow, the Mafia, right? We can see that we very, very realistically have a problem with accepting the differences among skin colors and culture. So when we talk about gender oppression, I would argue that gender oppression is the product child of a greater racial oppression, in which we see that by using mass degradation to degrade and kind of stereotype the culture, right? Set it as something less than the dominant culture, right? Then by removing the males, the females and the children of that race are completely left, completely like without a buffer to rampant forms of oppression. And so, yes, gender oppression is very serious. However, I would argue that the oppression is only allowed and only has access to be as severe and impactful because there's no buffer within some of these racial demographics to prevent that from happening, right? So we can all look out, right, in the same comparison I made between oppression and melanin pigmentation, that the white woman does not face the same level of oppression that the black female does, right? That the Hispanic woman, whether we want to consider her as white or not, right, does not face the same level of oppression as a black woman, but the white woman still does not face the same level of oppression as that Hispanic woman, right? Nor the Arab woman. And that's not because the men in that demographic are doing the primary oppressing, right? It truly is the truly only oppressive force that we can really point out and call out, right, is the white European male that operates out of a Eurocentric worldview and survival thrust. There's no other male able to oppress a white female or another female of another race besides the proximity within their own race, which is still minimal compared to the oppression they face by a greater white male population, right? So when we look at the percentages of the 51%, that 51% is only dominated and oppressed by white males, no other racial demographic. Thank you. I can see my time.
All right. Thank you so much, Cameron. We appreciate that. Now we're on to round two, our lightning round. So both participants get to engage in a cross-examination of each other's position. We'll have an ebb and flow where you'll get to hear from both and they'll go back and forth, but everybody will have an opportunity to listen and be heard. We ask our audience to please post questions in our comment sections because our Q&A round is after this one. So listen closely and type in your questions as we go. We have 20 minutes of open engage for this section.
Beautiful. I would like to go ahead and jump in just based on your opening statement, Mr. Montgomery. You had mentioned that the 51.1% of women that are in the United States are only oppressed by the white male demographic. That is definitely mind-boggling. But before I get into that further, I do want to ask you, right now we have a vice president who is Kamala Harris. She is Black and she is of Indian descent. But previous to her, we had a presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, who was running against Donald Trump in this country. She is a white woman and Donald Trump is a Black man, absolutely. But Hillary Clinton was not just more qualified based on her resume, her education, and less polarized, but she still lost against a man that had multiple sexual allegations on the books and in the court. Why do you think that was? Why do you think the general public still chose a misogynistic, sexual harassing man over a woman who has a track record of actually being in politics?
So, just to correct, Donald Trump is not a Black man. I understand that you made the misstatement. However, even in that situation, when we talk about the presidential situation, I could also ask why Shirley Chisholm wasn't given her rightful opportunity when she ran for president. And a lot of people believe that she had won that opportunity. Now, another thing that I would say within that is that when we deal with the Yoruba, right? So the white male with the Eurocentric mindset, operating a Eurocentric worldview and survival thrust, you got to understand that still also goes to the way he views his women, right? So the white man still sees the white woman as the prize and won't let any other demographic of males oppress the white woman. However, he still in his space believes that he is the dominating force or individual in that relational aspect. And so when we look at that,
correct, but that is also the same.
One second. If we look
Okay.
at the ideas of patriarchy and matriarchy, most European worldviews and survival thrust operate out of that patriarchy. So you will see a white European male feel that he deserves a position of power over a white female, right? However, when you look at natural African cultures, right, and survival thrusts and worldviews, we actually see that the Black female, right, deserves the position of power. So that's just the difference. So where we would be more akin to allow a Shirley Chisholm to be lifted up to that spot, or have no problem with Kamala Harris being vice president, we definitely see the antagonism, the issue within their demographic and their culture that did not allow Hillary Clinton her opportunity.
Okay. Now, are you saying that Black men do not participate in patriarchy or misogyny when it comes to their counterparts being Black women? Is that what you are saying? That this is specifically just an issue that white males and white female face in their community, but that excludes Black men or the relations between Black men and Black women? Is that what you are saying?
Not at all. So if I could go back to my opening statement, when I made the statement that when you look at the idea that gender oppression being the product child of a greater form of racial oppression, you cannot find an instance where you have an individual that's being oppressed racially, right, not also oppressing or having some form of violence or negative reaction towards the individuals within their proximity. And so, yes, we can say that there are Black individuals that are males that also oppress and have negative interactions with the Black female, right? But we also can say that it's also vice versa, that we also see negative behaviors coming from Black women towards Black men. So we cannot absolve either party within the Black demographic, right, of violence, oppression, and toxic behavior towards the other. But we can definitively look at the root cause of that, their base oppression that they equally face, that cause them to behave or have to do certain things towards the other to kind of survive in this American environment in which they are at a lower caste system.
Fascinating. Now, you mentioned, I don't know, you said that Black women also oppress Black men. Now, when it comes to oppression is a systemic issue. There are systems in our society. There are pillars of our society that govern these systems. So, for example, the pillar, one of the pillars of our society is religion. Okay. In the African American community, religion or Christianity more so, and Islam more so, are usually, what we gravitate towards. Both of these Abrahamic religions do not hold women in equal standard or on equal platform as men. In Islam, women are actually not allowed to worship in the same space as men. And in Christianity, for example, in Catholicism, even in the Baptist, I believe, ministry, women are still not considered able to become pastors and priests. These are structural, systemic oppression of women. There is a difference between a systemic oppression and a individual one-off base. Me arguing with my significant other does not mean that I oppress him. It means that we have differences. Yeah. But me going to church and wanting to become a pastor or a reverend, and the Baptist convention telling me that I cannot do that because I am a female, is a systemic form of oppression. Me wanting to become a president of whatever, the United States, and being told that my credentials are not worthy in comparison to a man with 30 plus sexual allegations in court, is a systemic form of oppression. So again, what do you mean by Black women oppress Black men? And let's keep this, as directly just based on the definition of oppression, please.
So using your example where you talk about the Black preacher and the Baptist and things like that, truthfully, I can't speak on something that predates America, right? So Christianity, Islam, that's not something that us as African Americans created. That's not something as Americans created. So you're asking me to kind of explain why a particular system, right, that was formed in patriarchy, like we discussed, because that is a Eurocentric, as we would say, religion system, right? Why they believe that the hierarchy in their religious system should be patriarchal compared to matriarchal. As I mentioned before, anything where we deal with the Afrocentric context and worldview, we can see that there's the to more of a matriarchal hierarchy and system. So when we deal with African Americans in particular, right, I would argue that we find ourselves in those situations because we're in a space we don't belong. You understand? So us going to a space where we understand that would be found uncredentialed, regardless of what credentials we have, right? I feel as though that's not just the Black woman, or that really is just the Black woman. White women have their opportunities to be faith leaders, right? Black women do not, right?
Interesting.
So when we look at the situation, we have to really truly understand that we do see Black women in a lot greater positions of authority, of power, as faith leaders, as heads of their households, of businesses. In comparison, we may not see that same level of leadership in other demographics because of that patriarchal, misogynistic mindset, right? So yes, we do have Black women that are oppressed by Black men. However, when we talk about the oppression of Black men by Black women, I think that we can see that whenever we do have an African-American woman in a position of power, and then she feels as though she has to perform, right, or behave for the white power structure, the Eurocentric systems that she is, whether it's a judge, whether it's an attorney, whether it's a public defender, she may opt, instead of loyalty to her race, making sure that that individual still is seen as a human being, she may opt to over punish, right, or over convict based on whatever concessions she may receive from doing so. And so we can talk about that a lot with female judges, female attorneys, female prosecutors.
Yeah, I see your point. I do. But there's some holes in there because right now we're speaking strictly about the United States. We're not talking about Africa. If we were talking about Africa, I mean, your argument would still have huge holes in it.
No.
But let's focus on the United States. Yes, absolutely. We have this thing called the founding fathers, but we don't have this thing called the founding mothers. But we definitely have the founding fathers, right? They wrote the Constitution. Previous to that, I'm sorry, while they were writing all of that, getting this whole America thing into a country, racism or racial oppression and slavery in the terms in terms of like Black Americans being enslaved in the United States, that wasn't a thing yet. They did start the country as a patriarchal country, right? Because again, we had the founding fathers, and then came in slavery. So what you've actually explained to me just now was that we already had a system of patriarchy, meaning there was already a hierarchy between men and women at that point from the very beginning. So again, it sounds like gender oppression is just a tad bit, it's just, it's been around for quite a while. But outside of that, let's move forward. I do have another question here. Currently in corporate America, overt racism is strictly frowned upon. Like, if you're out there being straight up racist, there are now corporations are actively seeking out diversity directors. I know a few of them, and racial bias trainings. They're getting ahead of racial, overt racism. That's what they're doing right now. But I cannot, for the life of me, name a single initiative that addresses sexism in the workplace before it happens. Can you?
A single initiative that addresses prejudice as far as sexual base, right, prior to the workplace. I believe that was really why white women received a lot of concessions of affirmative action. we a lot of times argue affirmative action was, like you said, was a attempt to kind of remove this overt racism. I would love to hear more of the actual effects and results that came from, you know, the whatever initiatives you've seen.
I
However,
think perhaps you
we look
misheard.
at affirmative action, we can all agree that that was something that benefited white women a lot more than it did any racial demographic. And so that, I guess, may answer your question right there.
No, I think you actually misheard me. So my question was, in corporate America today,
Mm-hmm.
overt racism is frowned upon. And these corporations are taking active steps to seek out diversity directors and to have racial bias trainings. So they're actively doing this before it happens. But most companies do not actually have a program that that answers the same question when it comes to racism. Now, they will absolutely have like a sexual harassment course after the fact, sexual bias courses after the fact. If something happens, then they'll do that. But something that is actually that answers the issue, or that fixes the issue from the front end, that's not a thing right now, which in my opinion means that sexism is more culturally accepted. Again, going back to the fact that we had a president for 4 years who had 30 plus allegations in court. Yes, he is a white man, but again, white people are still in the United States, and we are not strictly just talking about Black people. Again, you have to keep in mind, Black people in America are only 13% of our population. 13% in comparison to 51.1%, which is the female population in the United States. Just based on numbers alone, we are looking at two different numbers, and I'm not sure. I mean, math is really simple, but 51.1% just really makes sense. But I do get your perspective in saying that. I do get your perspective in saying that if we were thinking in a more Afrocentric mentality, then we might not view sexism as such an important issue. But I still think you're wrong on that. I really do. I really do. Because even in our communities as of right now, rape in the Black community is still swept under the rug. Let's talk about R. Kelly for a second. Let's talk about R. Kelly for a moment. R. Kelly is a sexual predator. It is a known fact. Yet he has a following of African American people that still listen to his music actively. And we have a group of people, even after the documentary came out, that still blamed these women and still spoke about these women as if they were clout chasers. Oh yeah, they came to R. Kelly at the age of 14, at the age of 13, because they wanted to be close to his celebrity. But at the age of 13 and 14, what child is mentally developed enough to make that decision? That is really the question. But we still, in the African American community, call these women, or these girls, really, we call them fast. We call them opportunists, although they're just adolescents. They don't fully grasp the knowledge of what they are actively doing. So let's talk about R. Kelly. Let's talk about Bill Cosby. Let's talk about these Black icons in our communities that are still receiving support from the Black community, even though they are actively not working towards the best interest of our community as a whole.
So I'm actually glad that you brought up Bill Cosby and R. Kelly, because truthfully, I feel as though that's sensationalism, right? So that's two individuals that have been found guilty, that are facing their consequences, and that rightfully are being chastised and held accountable for those actions by not just Black males, but Black females. To say that it's not happening is just choosing to exacerbate contradictions and see that there's no one that comes to the defense of the Black female or the Black community. So we could take a look at R. Kelly and Bill Cosby, but would we do that to cover up the long history of white males who came in and raped black women, black children, and the vast number of young black women who are being sex trafficked and human trafficked? Or are we going to ignore that for the sake of this debate? Now, if we want to have a conversation about gender oppression, again, let's understand that when you look at gender oppression, it is the seed child of a greater racial oppression, right? So all women of all races, right, have faced some form of rape, molestation, and trafficking by the white male population, right? We can definitively say that, right? So to then make it this conversation about, all right, well, what about these black guys that are doing it, right? They're scum, right? I don't like, forgive me if I'm about to use some language that I'm not supposed to. They're scum, they're not men. We don't represent them, right? So to kind of host the conversation as if we do put them on a pedestal, that's not the case. We can look at the numbers of how much R. Kelly's receiving in revenue compared to when this first kicked off and people found out compared to now, right? I'm sure you're aware about him being abused and stabbed in prison. We have a
I don't keep up with R. Kelly.
But you presented him for the argument
Yep,
of this debate,
because
so
it's definitely a hot topic. But R. Kelly is not an outlier in the African American community, unfortunately.
I understand. So you're not having a full understanding
So
of how
again,
you respond to molestation, rape of black women, right?
Yes.
In the prison system, we hold those individuals accountable, and that's knowledge, right?
Understood. Again, so outside of R. Kelly and outside of Bill Cosby, it is still a fact that in the African American community, Black women, Black girls experience sexual assault at a greater rate than any other racial counterpart.
You are correct, and they experience that by white
And
males.
this
Black
violence,
women and black females.
this
Now, it's
violence,
inappropriate to present a statistic like that without making sure that it's understood that there's the greater racial problem going on there. It's not just a bunch of black brothers going to these black children saying, you know what, I'm going to rape this individual. We know, and it's empirically stated, and it's been found, right? The individuals like the police officer Daniel Holtzclaw, right, and other individuals like that have been molesting black children and black women for years. And so to kind of throw that out there as if like there's no context to that, that's grossly inappropriate.
it sounds like you like to excuse Black men's violence by putting white men.
All right, that's the time for the lightning round. We appreciate you both for participating in that. And thank you to our audience for listening. We're going to our third round Q&A, audience Q&A. Each participant will have the opportunity to answer 4 questions uninterrupted. We ask our audience to please submit questions in our comments section so that we're able to pose to each of tonight's debaters. While we are awaiting the questions, we'd like to thank again our sponsor, Ebony's Bones, which is a live weekly radio show and podcast that explores, questions, and decolonizes for Black folk. Okay, so for our first question, we will ask you first, Funmilayo, arguing the affirmative again. This is from Stanley Elliott. Do Black people accept/embrace racism as much as women do sexism?
That's a great question. Do Black people embrace racism? That's one question. And do women embrace sexism? That's another question. Embrace or accept is not the right word. To embrace or accept something is to be complacent with the actuality of that situation. No. Black people do not embrace or accept racism. It is simply the reality of our world. Do women accept and embrace sexism? I'm sorry, let me put it this way. Are women raised in a patriarchal system that teaches them to accept and embrace sexism? Yes, absolutely.
Totally my bad. Forgive me, you all. I forgot I was on mute. Cameron arguing the negative will ask you the same question. Do Black people accept/embrace racism as much as women do sexism? You have a minute and 30 seconds.
So I do believe that the Black community as a whole, right, accepts and understands that racism exists. Do we embrace it? Embrace in the sense of, do we, hey, yes, racism. I think that we accept it as a situation that we understand. I don't think that we accept it as a situation as something that we need to address immediately, in the same way that we are pushing to address some of the sexism. As I mentioned in my preface, we do know that gender oppression is a serious thing. We know that women, Black females in particular, face the greatest level of oppression across any racial demographic, across the globe and across history. And so understanding that, right, to take care and to fight for that, right? But then we need our males to do the same, right? Because then that's the only way that we kind of can work back and kind of unroot some of this racial oppression. But first, starting with the fact that they're attacking our women, they're removing our males, right? By doing each one of those, there are different things that go into that. They kind of leave a greater hole for racial oppression, right? But when we deal with racism, right, fetish is a form of that, right? So we deal with how do white women or women of other cultures deal with Black males, right? Fetishizing them doesn't help.
Cameron. Now we'll go to our next question from Soji Nishur. I know I messed that up. Where does intersectionality fall in this discussion of oppression? And we will go back to our arguing the affirmative Funmilayo Ekundayo to answer this question. Again, you have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you. The intersectionality of racism and sexism is general oppression. Oppression, again, is an issue of power. It's a power struggle. And when it comes to racism, it is the exact same thing. It is someone exerting power over someone else. Which is why I'm standing on this side of the fence today. I believe that oppression started with, if you believe in Christianity, it started in the Garden of Eden, where Adam was told that he was at one, superior or to the woman, where the Christian God blamed the woman solely and punished her severely for eating the apple that they both shared. I believe that's really where that began, according to the Christian Bible. But all these religions all have the same thing in common, which is that women are not equal to men, and they should not expect to be equal to men. And I believe that's where that starts. I think that is where the intersectionality of oppression when it comes to race and sexism starts and ends. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Thanks so much for that. And now we will have Cameron arguing the negative. Answer the same question. Where does intersectionality fall in this discussion of oppression? Again, you have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
So I think the biggest thing about oppression, similar to what my opponent said, Funmilayo, when you look at oppression is a system that it uses division and isolation, right? So when you have a situation where you're isolating the females, the males of a demographic, or you're isolating a group from a greater community, so as far as like African Americans from all other Americans, right, then you're actually allowed to oppress them. You're allowed unabated access to those individuals. So we talk about intersectionality. I think it's important to always find the commonality and the common ground between two groups being oppressed, whether they're, I mean, like men and women of the Black community, whether you kind of, the same, right? Even though we know that fundamentally we face different forms of oppression, right? So, Black women being raped and molested, Black men have been broken and things like that. You have Black men who also like are denied jobs the same way Black women are denied jobs, right? We face the same oppressions in some ways, and we face very different forms of oppression, right? By making sure that at all else, right, we come together to ensure that at least we don't oppress each other, right? And anyone that's doing the oppression is pushed back, and there's, like I said, like there's a buffer set up so that no one is just left open to unabated oppression, right? Then we can actually solve some of these issues.
All right, thanks so much for that, Cameron. And now we'll bring up, again, arguing the affirmative, Funmilayo, for this next question. Does length of time of oppression, I think in the, help me here, does the length of time in oppression, gosh, how is this written? Does the length of time of oppression, is it the same as its severity? I think that's what they mean.
Yes.
The length of time in oppression is the same as its severity. You have to get 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you. Does the length of time of a specific form of oppression, does that give it the same priority as any other oppression? Well, yes and no. That's a yes and no question. The length of time that a specific oppression is going on in a specific community, the longer it continues, the more it becomes a norm. So does that make it more severe if it becomes a norm? Well, it depends on the mentality of the people that it affects. It changes over time. In the beginnings of slavery, that most definitely was significantly severe for those that it affected. But would I say that it was more severe than sexism for the Black women that suffered during slavery? Absolutely not. No, because again, there is an intersectional, there's a group that will always bear the brunt more so than anyone else. So does the length of time in oppression the same as its severity? Yes and no.
Thank you so much for that. Arguing the negative, Cameron, will ask you the same question. Does the length of time of oppression, is it equivalent to its severity?
So when the question was first asked, I initially thought about the idea of when someone touches a hot stove. Initially, once you touch that stove, the severity is extreme, right? You move back from the stove, you're still going to feel that pain from touching the stove, right? So the length of time of you touching the stove may not have been too long, but the pain from that initial touch is very much severe. Similar to standing out in the cold, right? It might take a longer time, right, a longer length of time for you to freeze to death and really feel like the true essence of that pain and what's going on, right? However, it's still as oppressive and it's still bad, right? So when we talk about duration compared to severity, right, you can be in situations where the oppression is so severe that you you collapse, right? So in some situations, when you're drowning, the body's going to go ahead and collapse in itself and save you from really enduring like the full brunt of that pain, right? Same with somebody that's being burnt alive, right? And so we can only endure so much, right? And so I don't think that the length of time is the same as the level of severity, right? However, you can measure level of severity over time by, without being too wordy, you can measure the level of severity over time.
All right, thank you for that. Our next question: do white women have proximal power over people of color that zeroes out their gender oppression at the hands of white males? And again, answering this question first will be arguing the affirmative, Funmilayo.
Do white women have the proximal power over Black people or people of color that zeroes out their gender oppression? No, they do not. No, white men and white women, again, crimes of violence are usually perpetrated intercommunally. So as much as we want to other white women or, set them apart and say that their suffering as far as sexism is concerned is reduced because they have structural power over Black people as a whole. No, it does not zero it out. No. It is still very much an issue because there are still women who are killed, women who are raped. It's 1 in 4 women actually who are raped, that have experienced rape. And that has nothing to do with their race. It doesn't. No.
All right, thank you so much for that, Funmilayo. And for our final question for our Q&A round for Mandla Deskins, this is for arguing the negative. Cameron, do you believe that solving racial oppression will automatically solve sexism for Black people? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
So through solving racial oppression is not a cure-all for all forms of oppression that may exist and be affecting the Black community. However, through solving racial oppression, it does allow the Black community to take inventory of where they stand, who's on their side, what resources and potential is allowed to them, so that they can now attack some of those without denigrating, right? But some of those secondary forms of oppression and things like that. And so hopefully nothing I said made it seem like solving racial oppression is a cure-all. However, it is the root cause of what is creating a lot of the issues for Africans in America.
Thank you so much, Cameron. And now we are going to our final round, closing statements. Each participant will have 4 minutes to present an uninterrupted closing statement to close out their argument for tonight. And our judges have been scoring all along the way, and we will present our final scorecard in the post-analysis debate. But here we go, guys, and ladies and gentlemen, I should say. Funmilayo, you have 4 minutes for your closing statement.
In addressing the issue of gender oppression, we often fail to realize that inequality does not only affect women, but men also. The expectations that we lay on the backs of men to fit into a mold that disregards their emotional and spiritual needs in exchange for an outward appearance of strength and a laissez-faire attitude towards relationships and friendships that would otherwise help their progress. Now, when we address the issue of equality of men and women, we usually focus only on the fact that women have been held back and need to be freed to take their rightful place in society. But we've heard it time and time again: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But Dr. King went even further in that speech and said, We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. If we view oppression in hierarchies, we have already divided ourselves. There is no hierarchy to oppression. There is an immediacy to achieving equality and justice for all. Not just for the benefit of the 13% or just for the 51.1%, but for all of us, all humanity. And so it will come to pass that when women participate fully and equally in the affairs of the world, when they enter confidently and capably the great arenas of laws and politics, war will cease, for women will be the obstacle and the hindrance to it. The master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. And what is a greater tool than gender injustice? This injustice that permeates all aspects of our existence from our birth to our death. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. Hence, this new age that we are coming into will be less masculine and more permeated with the feminine ideals, an age in which the masculine and the feminine elements of our society and our civilization will be more evenly balanced. An age in which laws regarding women's health is not decided by a panel of men, and racial differences are seen as nothing more than nature's way of reminding us that there is beauty in diversity, where feminine ideals like emotional vulnerability is not seen as a weakness, but a necessary part of the human condition. I would like for us to examine our learned behaviors and our ideals and establish that bridge to a better understanding of gender dynamics. This inevitably will have a greater influence in the world as we know it, from politics to education to our communities and our families. As this month is Women's History Month, I would like for all of us to use this opportunity to appreciate the women in our lives for the individuals that they are, rather than for the gender roles that they hold in our hearts. Thank you so much for coming to watch.
All right, thank you so much, Funmilayo. And now we will hear closing statements from Cameron Montgomery arguing the negative. Cameron, you have 4 minutes.
Hey, so I want to close by thanking you guys for again allowing us to debate, and to my opponent, happy Women's History Month. You know what? I really love this debate with you. However, I also want to thank you for the knowledge that you provided, because in a lot of ways we agree, right? And a lot of things you said in your closing statement kind of reinforces everything I'm saying on racial oppression. And so I just close and say again, I mentioned the idea of the Yorugu, right? So it's when a white male, right, but we can also include the white female, right, operates out of a Eurocentric worldview and survival thrust. Now, we also have Africans on the continent and throughout the diaspora who rightfully should be able to operate out of an Afrocentric worldview and survival thrust. What is needed and right for the African is not the same for what is needed and right for the European. Again, I mentioned that for the European, they operate out of a patriarchal mindset. For the African, they operate out of a more matriarchal mindset, right? And so what I really truly love about Funmilayo's closing statement is how she said we're moving into a time period where it's more feminine, right? Where it's more matriarchal, right? That means we're moving into a worldview and a world context that is more Afrocentric in nature, right? And that's what's best to solve a lot of these problems, because the Afrocentric worldview is more communal as opposed to more selfish, right? And so when we take in the idea that we've been in this country for 400, 500 years in an unnatural, abnormal circumstance, being Africans in America, prisoners of war, right? We are honestly allowing rampant, unabated oppression every day that we exist here, and we don't either change the dominant like structures and systems that exist, and make sure that as the white male ensures that these systems and structures work for the white woman, that we ensure that every system and structure is fit and works for the black female, right, and the black children, right. And so I just urge us when we walk away from here today to understand that oppression, period, exists, right? Gender oppression is something that immediately we have to stop. By stopping and solving gender oppression, we allow both men and women, males and females, to come together to fight this greater thing called racial oppression. When we look at each other and say, you know, my brother, my sister, I love you no matter what you think, feel, and believe, right? I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to die for you. I'm going to live for you, right? Then we can kind of uproot some of these century-long problems in situations where, yeah, we know that black children are being miseducated, abused all day long, right? But it's because we don't have our fathers in the household. That's a statistical, empirical, like, data point that we know. Without black male fathers in the family structure, all kinds of problems happen. And we've seen that play out in our court systems and in our prison system, right? Black mothers have been doing the best they can, right? It's now that we allow our black mothers to lead, right? But then also to find ways to keep their husbands in their house, keep their sons in their house, keep their children in their house, right? And that only can happen once we come together and stop finding a reason to have to, you know, divide ourselves, right? There's truly no antagonistic force between black men and black women besides our mutual oppression. That cannot be said the same for the white male and white female. The white male knows that he is, as far as population-wise, small, like a lot less than the white woman, right? So his Yorugu, right, causes him to have to compete with the white woman the same way he does all other races.
Okay, little tech there. All right, thank you so much. We'd like to thank both of tonight's participants and debaters arguing the affirmative again, Funmilayo Ekundayo, and arguing the negative, Cameron Montgomery. We've had a critical exchange that will hopefully move us all forward as a people and a nation. We appreciate you for debating and engaging with us tonight. We invite you to sign up for a debate. Those of you who are listening to us and watching us, we've put our debate matchup form in the comments section, and we ask that you or someone that you know that may be good at debating or even want the practice of being able to debate can sign up and let us know your positions on different topics. We appreciate our judges, Amber Vaughn, Farahania, and Dr. Ofemi Onifade. We ask our judges to please use the scorecard to let us know how you scored each participant's performance. For our audience, the judges are scoring based on fact-based arguments. So did the participants provide facts to support their arguments? They're judging on subject matter expertise. Did they demonstrate an understanding to the subject matter? They're judging on persuasiveness. Was it logical and convincing in their argument? Also, elocution. Were the debaters clear and effective in their communication? And finally, for the rebuttals, did they address their opponent's arguments? Thank you to you, our audience, for watching and submitting your questions during the Q&A. We need your support to keep this program running. Please donate to our Cash App so that we continue to grow. We're excited to be in our second season, and we hope to make this an even better season. Also, please check us out on YouTube and subscribe. Our YouTube page is The Great Debate League, Inc., and you can also become a member of our Patreon page. We would like to thank our sponsor again for this evening's event, Ebony's Bones, a local live weekly podcast and radio show that explores, questions, and decolonizes. Please join us after the broadcast for the post-analysis debate, where we will announce the winner of tonight's debate, along with how the judges scored. A new broadcast will start in a few moments, and we've posted the link to that broadcast in the comments section. Thank you again, everybody, for watching and participating. Have a great night, and remember to speak the truth.